My daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Frank, my parents are moving into your house next Saturday. We already told them yes." She didn't ask. She didn't suggest. She announced it like she was reading a weather forecast, flat, certain, final. And my son just stood there behind her, staring at the kitchen floor like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county. I built bridges for a living, real ones, steel and concrete, and I know better than anyone that a structure only holds if the foundation is sound. I also know that when something is structurally compromised, no amount of paint or pretty trim is going to save it. You have to deal with the problem directly. No shortcuts. My name is Frank. I live alone in a 4-bedroom house in Greenfield, Ohio. A town small enough that everyone knows your business, but big enough that you can still disappear into your backyard on a Sunday afternoon and not see a soul. My wife, Carol, passed away 4 years ago from a stroke. It was sudden. It was devastating. And in the months that followed, I did what men of my generation do. I kept moving. I mowed the lawn. I fixed the gutters. I showed up to my grandson's baseball games. I kept the house because Carol loved that house, and because some mornings I still wake up expecting to smell her coffee. My son is named Daniel. He's 34. He married a woman named Melissa about 3 years ago, and the wedding was beautiful outdoor ceremony, late September, the trees just starting to turn. I paid for a significant portion of it because Daniel asked me to, and because I genuinely liked Melissa at the time. She was sharp, funny, had a good job in pharmaceutical sales. I thought Daniel had done well for himself. What I didn't see clearly then, or maybe what I chose not to see, was Melissa's relationship with her own parents. Her father, Raymond, had retired early at 58 after a back injury. Her mother, Gloria, had never worked outside the home. They lived about 40 minutes away in a rental property in Lancaster, and from what I gathered, they were not careful with money. Raymond drove a truck he couldn't afford. Gloria redecorated their living room twice in 1 year. They were always between things financially, between jobs, between plans, between solutions that never quite materialized. None of that was my business. Until the day it suddenly was. It started small, the way these things always do. About 6 months after the wedding, Melissa mentioned at a family dinner that her parents were going through a rough patch. Raymond's truck had broken down. They were behind on rent. Daniel nodded sympathetically, and I offered nothing because it wasn't my place. A few weeks later, Melissa mentioned it again. Her parents were looking at apartments, but everything was so expensive. Again, I listened and said little. Then came the Sunday afternoon when Daniel and Melissa showed up at my door unannounced. I was in the garage reorganizing Carol's gardening tools, something I did sometimes just to feel close to her. Daniel looked nervous. Melissa looked like she'd already won an argument I didn't know we were having. She told me her parents needed a place to stay. Temporarily, she said, using air quotes that made it feel anything but. She explained that Raymond and Gloria's landlord was selling the property and they had 60 days to vacate. She said they hadn't been able to find anything affordable in Lancaster. And then she said the thing that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "You have 4 bedrooms, Frank. You live alone. It just makes sense." I set down the trowel I was holding. I looked at my son. He met my eyes for about half a second, and then found the garage floor more interesting. "It doesn't make sense to me," I said. Melissa smiled the way people smile when they think you're being slow. "Frank, it's just temporary. 2, maybe 3 months. You have the space. It would really help our family. I want to be clear about something." I did not raise my voice. I did not get emotional. I simply said, "This is my home, Melissa. I'll give it some thought." And I walked back inside and finished my coffee. That night, I did give it thought. Serious thought. I thought about what 2 or 3 months actually means when someone has nowhere else to go and no urgency to find somewhere. I thought about Raymond's truck and Gloria's redecorating habit. I thought about the fact that my house, the house Carol and I had paid off together, would suddenly have 2 strangers living in it who had no lease, no timeline, and no legal obligation to leave. I thought about being 63 years old, living alone, having earned every quiet morning and peaceful evening in that house. By the time I went to bed, I had my answer. A few days later, I called Daniel. Just Daniel, not Melissa. I told him clearly that I was not comfortable with the arrangement. I told him I loved him, and I wanted to help his family. But inviting two adults to live in my home indefinitely was not something I was willing to do. I told him if Raymond and Gloria needed financial help for a security deposit on an apartment, I would contribute something reasonable. But they could not move in. Daniel said he understood. He said he'd talk to Melissa. He talked to Melissa. Melissa called me the next evening. That conversation was significantly less pleasant. She told me I was being selfish. She said Carol would have wanted me to help family. She said that I had more than enough space, and that hoarding a 4-bedroom house all to myself while her parents struggled was something she found morally troubling. She used that phrase, morally troubling. I let her finish. Then I said, Melissa, my answer hasn't changed. And I ended the call. What followed was 3 weeks of pressure that came from every direction. Daniel called to say Melissa was really upset. Melissa texted me long messages that began with, I just want you to understand, and ended with something that felt like a threat. My sister-in-law, who had no business being involved, called to ask if I'd really said no to a family in need. Even Raymond called me once, the first time he'd ever called me directly, and delivered a rambling speech about how he'd always considered me family, and how family takes care of family. I listened to all of it. I said very little. My answer did not change. Then things escalated in a way I hadn't anticipated. One evening I came home from my weekly dinner with my friend Howard to find Raymond's silver Chevy Silverado parked on the street in front of my house. Raymond and Gloria were sitting inside it. When I pulled into my driveway, they got out. Gloria was carrying a casserole dish covered in foil. Raymond was smiling, the smile of a man who has decided the answer to a problem is simply to show up. We thought we'd come say hello, Gloria said, holding out the casserole. I made my chicken and rice. I was polite. I accepted the dish. I did not invite them inside. I thanked them for coming by, said I was tired from dinner, and went inside and locked the door. Through the front window, I watched them sit in that truck for another 20 minutes before driving away. 2 nights later, they were back. This time, they knocked. I answered the door in my bathrobe. Raymond said they were in the neighborhood. I told him I was heading to bed and wished them a good evening. I closed the door. I called Daniel the next morning. I told him what was happening. I told him that if his in-laws showed up at my home uninvited again, I would be calling the non-emergency police line and reporting it as harassment. I did not say this to be dramatic. I said it because I meant it, and because I wanted it on record that I had warned him. Daniel apologized. He sounded exhausted. I almost felt sorry for him. Then came the Tuesday night that changed everything. I was asleep when my phone buzzed at 11:45. It was a text from Melissa. We need to talk. This isn't over. I silenced my phone and went back to sleep. At 2:17 in the morning, my doorbell rang. Then it rang again. Then someone knocked, not politely, but the kind of knocking that rattles the frame. I got up, put on my robe, and looked through the peephole. It was Daniel and Melissa. Melissa was in a coat over what looked like pajamas. Daniel looked like he hadn't slept. I did not open the door. Frank, we need to talk right now, Melissa said through the door. My parents have to be out by Friday. This is an emergency. I spoke through the door. It is 2 in the morning. This is not an appropriate time for this conversation. Go home. Frank, please. Melissa. I kept my voice low and even. I'm going to tell you one more time. Go home. If you're still here in 5 minutes, I'm calling the police. There was a long silence. Then I heard them walking back to their car. I watched from the upstairs window as they drove away. Then I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I sat up until 4 in the morning, writing down every date, every call, every text, every unannounced visit. I wrote it all down in a spiral notebook with a pen, the way my father taught me to document things when you don't yet know why you'll need the documentation. It turned out I needed it sooner than I expected. The following week, I received a letter from a law office. It was from an attorney named Gerald Hutchins, and it stated that his clients Raymond and Gloria were asserting a claim of implied tenancy based on my alleged verbal agreement to allow them to reside in my property. The letter demanded that I honor this agreement or face legal action. I read the letter twice. Then I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I've dealt with contract disputes for 30 years, and I knew immediately that this had no legal foundation whatsoever. I had made no verbal agreement. I had made no agreement of any kind. I had said I'll give it some thought in my own garage and followed it with a clear, documented refusal. I called an attorney I knew named Susan Park, who handled property and estate matters. I had worked with her twice before, once when Carol passed, and once when I had a boundary dispute with a neighbor over a fence line. She was sharp, no nonsense, and she did not waste my time. Susan reviewed the letter and confirmed what I already knew. The claim was baseless. There was no tenancy agreement, implied or otherwise. She also told me something useful, the fact that I had documentation of every interaction, every date, every message, worked enormously in my favor. She advised me to stop engaging directly with anyone involved and to let her handle all communication going forward. I did exactly that. Over the next 2 weeks, I forwarded every text message and voicemail to Susan, and there were many. Melissa sent 17 text messages in one 4-day span. Raymond left voicemails that started out conciliatory and grew progressively more agitated. In one message, he told me I was going to regret this. In another, he said that I had made a promise, which I had not, and that he had witnesses. He did not have witnesses because there was nothing to witness. Daniel called me once during this period. He sounded like a man who had realized he was in the middle of something and didn't know how to get out. He said, "Dad, I'm really sorry about all of this." I told him I loved him and that my door was always open to him. But I told him that what was happening had moved beyond a family disagreement and that I needed him to understand I was going to protect myself legally if I had to. He said he understood. I believed him. The court date came on a cold morning in November. Greenfields County Courthouse is a beautiful old building with marble floors and high ceilings, the kind of place that makes you feel the weight of things. Susan was with me. Raymond and Gloria arrived with Gerald Hutchins, their attorney, who looked like a man who had taken this case without fully reviewing it. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Weston. She was methodical, unhurried, and had clearly read the filing before she walked into the room. Gerald Hutchins presented his client's case first. He argued that I had made a verbal commitment to house Raymond and Gloria, that they had relied on that commitment to their detriment, and that I was therefore obligated to follow through. He cited detrimental reliance. He used a lot of confident language. Then Susan presented our response. She submitted my documentation, the spiral notebook entries, the text messages, the voicemails. She presented the written record of my clear refusal communicated to Daniel on the phone. She presented the 2 instances of unannounced nighttime visits. And then she played 3 of Raymond's voicemails out loud in the courtroom. The first one was rambling but civil. The second one mentioned witnesses to a promise that didn't exist. The third one, the one from the second to last week before the court date, was something else entirely. Raymond's voice on that recording was loud and unsteady. He said I had destroyed his family. He said I would understand consequences. He said things that made the courtroom very quiet. Judge Weston listened to all 3 without expression. She ruled in my favor completely. There was no tenancy agreement. There was no verbal contract. There was no legal basis for the claim whatsoever. She noted, for the record, that the pattern of conduct described in my documentation, the unannounced visits, the late-night appearance, the threatening voicemail, was concerning, and she advised the plaintiff's counsel to ensure his clients understood the legal boundaries around harassment. Gerald Hutchins did not look like a confident man when court adjourned. Outside the courthouse, Susan shook my hand. I drove to a diner on the edge of town called the Maple, ordered black coffee and eggs over easy, and sat by the window watching the November light move across the parking lot. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, not triumph exactly, more like equilibrium, like a load-bearing wall that had been tested and held. The aftermath unfolded quietly, the way most things do once the noise stops. Raymond and Gloria found a rental in a complex on the east side of Lancaster. I don't know the details because it wasn't my business. Daniel told me later that Melissa's parents had received some help from a community assistance program and a partial contribution from Melissa's older brother, who who had apparently been asked much earlier and had quietly declined. I found a certain symmetry in that. Melissa and Daniel went through a rough stretch. Daniel was honest with me about it, more honest than I expected. He came to my house on a Sunday in December, the kind of cold gray Sunday that makes everything feel still. He sat at my kitchen table and he said, "Dad, I should have said no from the beginning. I should have protected you." He was 34 years old, and he looked, for a moment, like the 12-year-old who used to bring me his problems at this same table. I told him what I believed to be true, that marriage is complicated, that loyalty gets tested in ways you don't anticipate, and that the fact that he was sitting in my kitchen saying these words told me everything I needed to know about who he fundamentally was. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him to go home and be good to his wife and figure it out together. He nodded. He drank his coffee. Before he left, he stopped in the doorway and said, "There's something I need to tell you. Melissa is pregnant." He was smiling the way men smile when the world has suddenly rearranged itself into something better than they deserve. I stood up and hugged my son for a long time. In February, I met my grandson for the first time. They named him Carter. He had Carol's nose. I noticed it immediately, and it made my throat tighten in the way I've learned to just let happen. I held him in the rocking chair by the living room window, the same chair where Carol used to read on Sunday afternoons, and I watched the bare winter trees in the backyard and thought about what it means to hold something that belongs to the future. Melissa came into the room and sat on the couch across from me. She didn't say much, but after a while, she said, "I'm sorry, Frank, for all of it." She said it plainly, without performance. I believe she meant it. I told her the same thing I told Daniel, that we were family, and family is allowed to be imperfect, and what matters is where you land. People ask me sometimes how I stayed calm through all of it, the pressure, the threats, the 2 a.m. door knocking, and I tell them the truth. I wasn't always calm on the inside. There were nights I lay awake running the numbers. What if the court went the other way? What if this fractured things with Daniel permanently? What if I'd been too rigid, too cold, too something? But here's what I came back to every time. This was my home. Carol and I bought this house when Daniel was 7 years old. We painted every room ourselves. We replaced the roof the year Daniel started high school. We planted the oak tree in the backyard the spring before she got sick, and that tree is 12 feet tall now. No one, not Raymond, not Gloria, not a letter from a law office, had the right to simply declare that their need gave them access to something that Carol and I built together. Boundaries are not cruelty. Saying no is not the same as saying I don't care. And the people who tell you otherwise, who dress up entitlement as family obligation, are not asking you to love them more. They're asking you to love yourself less. I'm 63 years old. I have a 4-bedroom house in Greenfield, Ohio. I have a son who came back to me, and a grandson named Carter, who has his great-grandmother's nose. On Sunday mornings, I sit in Carol's rocking chair with my coffee, and I watch the oak tree we planted together, and I think that a life can be measured in what you refuse to give away just because someone demanded it loudly enough. The foundation holds because you maintain it. That was true for bridges. It turned out to be true for everything else, too.